It's going to be a simple lesson on JavaScript Closure. So I'm going to give you a few examples of scope, so global scope, and then the function scope, and also how we can create a simple closure where we have access to this value. Even though the function has run, we're still able to access it. So we've got the example here where we're looping through the value of count and it's being output. And then there's also another example of where we've got the count2 without the inner function. So we don't have a function that's being returned back. And as we can see, that's going to work slightly different, and that's not going to be an example of closure. It's simply going to be returning back the value of count. Where we don't have a value of count, it's going to be a value of 0, and that's what's going to get logged out into the console. This lesson, we're going to be looking at the JavaScript closure. I've got an HTML file linked to a file called app2.js, and that's within the web editor that I'm using. On the right-hand side, we've got the output within the browser, and I've got the dev tools open using the Chrome browser. So let's begin. A closure in JavaScript is a function that has access to variables within its parent scope. So when you create a variable, I'm just going to create one variable, and we'll just give it a value of a. And so this one will hold a value of hello. So this is going to be scope, and this is within the global scope because there's no other blocks of code that it's sitting within. So this is sitting within the parent scope. If we were to create a function, and this function is just going to be ABC function, and we also create a variable called a within this scope, and within this case we're just going to call it hello or world, and the global scope is going to be hello. So these are the two different scopes, and this is why we can have both of those outputs. If we output the value of a, and then we invoke the function, and we also output the value of a, the value of a will still be hello. So refresh, and there we've got the two outputs of hello, because they're both sitting on different scopes. If we were to move the console message within the function as it's being invoked, it's going to reference the value of the variable a within this function scope. And if it finds the value of a within the function scope, then it's going to use that one, outputting it into the console as world. If there's no value of a within the function scope, then it'll look to the parent scope for a value of a, and this in case it's finding a value of hello, so it's outputting that into the console as well. With a closure, we have access to the value from within the parent scope. So let's go ahead and we're going to create another function, and we'll call it makeCount. And this is going to be a simple function that's going to set a variable of count, setting it with a value of 0, and then returning the function itself as a closure within the function, and returning the value of count plus 1. So when we invoke this function, we'll see that even though this value in this variable of count is sitting within this scope of the function, we're still going to be able to call and output the value because it's being returned from within inside of the function back to the variable. And that's how we can have a quick example of JavaScript closure. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to set and create another counter. And this counter is going to be assigned to the function. So when we console log, and we'll make a few of these, so let's create a for loop. So set x to equal 0, and then while x is less than 10, and we'll increment x by 1. And then within here, we can console log out whatever the value for the count is, and invoking the function within the console log. So that's going to give us an output of 0, starting at 0, and moving all the way to 9, as we're accessing the value of count every time. So the closure allows the data to be closed over or remembered by the inner function, even after the outer function has returned. And in this case, we've got the outer function returning the function, and it allows us to remember the inner value. Returns an inner function that has access to the count variable that's been declared in its parent scope. So this is the parent scope and this is the inner scope, and count has access to the value of count that's sitting outside of this return function scope. And it can remember the current count value even after the function has completed execution. So typically when you do have a function and we do set a variable as we did within ABC, once that function stops running, we're not going to have access to the value of the variable. So let's create one more example of how when we don't have access to the variable, and we'll call it makeCount2. And what we'll do in this case, we'll set a value of count, also just as we did within the closure. And this will simply just return back the value of count. And then we'll set a value for the count2, invoking makeCount2. I'll move the functions above. We can console log out the value of the count2 as well. And we see when we do it this way that we do throw an error accessing the function that's contained within the makeCount2 as we were within the makeCount. So that's why this won't work. But we can assign it to the function itself, the function code, and what happens now is that it simply returns back 0 because the value of count is 0. So even though that we're incrementing up by 1, the value at the count is still going to be 0 when it gets returned back for count2. So that's the difference between when we have a closure and when we're not using the closure. So the closure allows us to simply remember the count each time the inner function is called. And you do need to have the inner function within the function in order to return back the value.